Good evening, everybody. It's another Sunday and a time for a story hour. Had a little temporal shift. Wanted to wish everybody a happy Easter. We got bunnies. And we got a couple stories here. Having a little rough time with my voice, but we'll read for a bit and see how we go. Good to see you folks here, and we're gonna zip right down the hippity-hoppity garden trail and get right to the books. Here we are at our garden gate. Let's get inside and get to the reading. And tonight, we're starting off with another from our gigantic collection of fairy tales. This is The Colony of Cats. Long, long ago, as far back as the time when animals spoke, there lived a community of cats in a deserted house not far from a large town. They had everything they could possibly desire for their comfort. They were well fed and well lodged, and if by any chance an unlucky mouse was stupid enough to venture in their way, they caught it, not to eat, but for the pure pleasure of catching it. The old people of the town related how they had heard their parents speak of a time when the whole country was so overrun with rats and mice that not so much as a grain of corn was to be gathered in the fields. And it might be out of gratitude to the cats who had rid the country of these plagues that their descendants were allowed to live in peace. No one knows where the cats got the money to pay for everything, or who paid it, for all this happened so very long ago. But one thing is certain, they were rich enough to keep a servant, for though they lived very happily together, and did not scratch or fight more than human beings would have done, they were not clever enough to do the housework themselves, and preferred at all events to have someone to cook their meat, which they scorned to eat raw. Not only were they very difficult to please about the housework, but most women quickly tired of living alone with only cats for companions, and consequently they never kept a servant long. It had become a saying in the town, when anyone found herself reduced to her last penny, "I will go and live with the cats," and many a poor woman actually did so. Now Lizina was not happy at home, for her mother, who was a widow, was much fonder of her elder daughter. Often the youngest one fared very badly and had not enough to eat, while her sister could have everything she desired, and if Lizina dared to complain she was certain to receive a good beating. At last the day came when she was at the end of her patience, and she exclaimed to her mother and sister, "Since you hate me so much, you will be glad to get rid of me, so I am going to live with the cats." "Away with you!" cried her mother, seizing an old broom handle from behind the door. Poor Lizina did not wait to be told twice, but ran off at once, and never stopped till she reached the door of the cat's house. Their cook had left them that very morning with her face all scratched, the result of such a quarrel with the head of the house that he had nearly clawed out her eyes. Lizina therefore was warmly welcomed, and she set to work at once to prepare the dinner, not without many misgivings as to the taste of the cats, and whether she would be able to satisfy them. Going to and fro about her work, she found herself frequently hindered by a constant succession of cats who appeared one after another in the kitchen to inspect the new servant. She had one in front of her feet, another perched on the back of her chair while she peeled vegetables, a third sat on the table beside her, and 5 or 6 others prowled about among the pots and pans on the shelves against the wall. The air resounded with their purring, which meant they were pleased with their new maid. But Lizina had not yet learned to understand their language, and often she did not know what they wanted her to do. However, as she was a good, kind-hearted girl, she set to work to pick up the little kittens which tumbled about on the floor. She patched up quarrels and nursed on her lap a big tabby, the oldest of the community, which had a lame paw. All these kindnesses could hardly fail to make a favorable impression on the cats, and it was even better after a while, when Lizina had become accustomed to their strange ways. Never had the house been kept so clean, the meat so well served, nor the sick cats so well cared for. Some weeks later, they had a visit from an old cat whom they called their father, who lived by himself in a barn at the top of the hill, and came down from time to time to inspect the little colony. He was much taken with Lizina, and on seeing her asked, "Are you well served by this nice black-eyed little person?" And the cats answered with one voice, "Oh, yes, Father Gatto, we have never had such a good servant." At each of his visits, the answer was always the same. But after a time, the old cat, who was very observant, noticed that the little maid was looking sadder and sadder. "What is the matter, my child? Has anyone been unkind to you?" he asked one day, when he found her almost crying in her kitchen. She burst into tears and answered between her sobs, "Oh, no! They are all very good to me, but I long for news of home, and I pine to see my mother and sister." Gatto, being a sensible old cat, understood the little servant's feelings. "You shall go home," he said, "and you shall not come back here unless you please. But first you must be rewarded for your kind services to my children. Follow me down into the inner cellar where you have never been before, for I always keep it locked and carry the key away with me." Lizina looked around her in astonishment as they went down into the great vaulted cellar underneath the kitchen. Before her stood 2 big earthenware water jugs, one of which contained oil, the other a liquid shining like gold. "Into which of these jars shall I dip you?" asked Father Gatto, with a grin that showed all his sharp white teeth, while his mustaches stood out straight on either side of his face. The little maid looked at the 2 jars from under her long dark lashes. "In the oil jar," she answered timidly, thinking to herself, "I could not ask to be bathed in gold." But Father Gatto replied, "No, no, you have deserved something better than that." And seizing her in his strong paws, he plunged her into the liquid gold. Wonder of wonders! When Lizina came out of the jar, she shone from head to foot like the sun in the heaven on a fine summer's day. Her pretty pink cheeks and long black hair alone kept their natural color, but otherwise she had become like a statue of pure gold. Father Gatto purred loudly with satisfaction. "Go home," he said, "and see your mother and sister. But take care, if you hear the cock crow, to turn toward it. If, on the contrary, the donkey brays, you must look the other way." The little maid, having gratefully kissed the white paw of the old cat, set off for her home. Just as she got near her mother's house, the cock crowed, and quickly she turned toward it. Immediately, a beautiful golden star appeared on her forehead, crowning her glossy black hair. At the same time, the donkey began to bray. But Lizina took care not to look over the fence into the field where the donkey was feeding. Her mother and sister, who were in front of their house, uttered cries of admiration and astonishment when they saw her, and their cries became still louder when Lizina, taking her handkerchief from her pocket, drew out a handful of gold also. For some days the mother and her 2 daughters lived very happily together, for Lizina had given them everything she had brought away, except her golden clothing, for that would not come off, in spite of all the efforts of her sister, who was madly jealous of her good fortune. The golden star, too, could not be removed from her forehead, but the gold pieces she drew from her pockets had found their way to her mother and sister. "I will go now and see what I can get out of the pussies," said Peppina, the elder girl, one morning, as she took Lizina's basket and fastened her purses into her own skirt. "I should like some of the cat's gold for myself," she thought, as she left her mother's house before the sun rose. The cat colony had not yet hired another servant, for they knew they could never get one to replace Lizina, whose loss they had not ceased to mourn. When they heard that Peppina was her sister, they ran to meet her. "She is not the least like her," the kittens whispered among themselves. "Hush, be quiet," the older cat said. "All servants cannot be pretty." No, decidedly she was not at all like Lizina. Even the most reasonable and generous of the cats soon acknowledged that. The very first day she shut the kitchen door in the faces of the tomcats, who used to enjoy watching Lizina at her work, and a young and a mischievous cat, who jumped in by the open kitchen window and alighted on the table, got such a blow with the rolling pin that he squalled for an hour. With every day that passed, the household became more and more aware of its misfortune. The work was as badly done as the servant was surly and disagreeable. Heaps of dust collected in the corners of the room. Spiders' webs hung from the ceilings and in front of the window panes. The beds were hardly ever made, and the feather beds, so beloved by the old and feeble cats, had never once been shaken since Lizina left the house. At Father Gatto's next visit, he found the whole colony in a great state of uproar. "Caesar has one paw so badly swollen that it looks as if it were broken," said one. "Peppina kicked him with her great wooden shoes. Hector has an abscess on his back where a wooden chair was flung at him, and Agrippina's 3 little kittens have died of hunger beside their mother, because Peppina forgot them in their basket up in the attic. There is no putting up with the creature. Do send her away, Father Gatto. Lizina herself would not be angry with us. She must know very well what her sister is like." "Come here," said Father Gatto in his most severe tones to Peppina, and he took her down into the cellar and showed her the same 2 great jars that he had shown Lizina. "Into which of these shall I dip you?" he asked, and she made haste to answer, "In the liquid gold," for she was no more modest than she was good and kind. Father Gatto's yellow eyes darted fire. "You have not deserved it," he uttered in a voice like thunder, and seizing her, he flung her into the jar of oil, where she was nearly suffocated. When she came to the surface screaming and struggling, the vengeful cat seized her again and rolled her in the ash heap on the floor. Then when she rose, dirty, blinded, and disgusting to behold, he thrust her from the door, saying, "Begone! When you meet a braying donkey, be careful to turn your head toward it." Stumbling and raging, Peppina set off for home, thinking herself fortunate to find a stick by the wayside with which to support herself. She was within sight of her mother's house when she heard the voice of a donkey loudly braying in the meadow on the right. Quickly she turned her head toward it, and at the same time put her hand up to her forehead where, waving like a plume, was a donkey's tail. She ran home to her mother at full speed, yelling with rage and despair, and it took Lizina 2 hours, with a big basin of hot water and 2 cakes of soap, to wash off the layer of oil and ashes with which Father Gatto had adorned her. As for the donkey's tail, it was impossible to get rid of that. It was as firmly fixed on her forehead as was the golden star on Lizina's. Their mother was furious. She first beat Lizina unmercifully with the broom. Then she took her to the mouth of the well and lowered her into it. She went away, leaving her stranded at the bottom, weeping and crying for help. Before this happened, however, the king's son, in passing the mother's house one day, had seen Lizina sitting and sewing in the parlor, and had been dazzled by her beauty. After coming back 2 or 3 times, he at last ventured to approach the window, and to whisper in the softest voice, "Lovely maiden, will you be my bride?" And she had answered, "I will." Next morning, when the prince arrived to claim his bride, he found her wrapped in a large white veil. "It is thus that maidens are received from their parents' hands," said the mother, who hoped to make the king's son marry Peppina in place of her sister, and had fastened the donkey's tail around her head, like a lock of hair under the veil. The prince was young and a little timid, so he made no objections, and he seated Peppina in the carriage beside him. Their way led past the old house inhabited by the cats, who were all at the window, for the report had got about that the prince was going to marry the most beautiful maiden in the world, on whose forehead shone a golden star, and they knew that this could only be their adored Lizina. As the carriage slowly passed in front of the old house, where cats from all parts of the world seemed to be gathered, a song burst from every throat. "Mew, mew, mew! Prince, look quick behind you! In the well is fair Lizina, and you have nothing but Peppina." When he heard this, the coachman, who understood the cat's language better than the prince did, stopped his horses and asked, "Does your highness know what the grimalkins are saying?" The song broke forth again, louder than ever. With a turn of his hand, the prince threw back the white veil, and discovered beneath it the puffed-up, swollen face of Peppina, with the donkey's tail twisted around her head. "Ah, traitoress!" he exclaimed, quivering with rage, and ordering the horses to be turned around, he drove the elder daughter back to the woman who had sought to deceive him. With his hand on the hilt of his sword, he demanded Lizina in so fierce a voice that the mother hastened to the well to draw her prisoner out. Lizina's clothing and her star shone so brilliantly that when the prince led her home to the king, his father, the whole palace was lit up. Next day they were married, and lived happily ever after, and all the cats, headed by old Father Gatto, were at the wedding. And that is the end of The Colony of Cats, which is apparently an older Italian story. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming in. I'm very glad to see you all. Yeah, sorry, Rabbit. It's a it's a fairy tale. There's no punches pulled with some of these things. Hello, Bio. Hi, Sam and Mabel. Exactly, Mabel. That's the lesson there. Is you got to be nice to the kitty cats, otherwise bad things happen. And like I said, I'm sorry my voice is kind of going tonight, but we're gonna keep going, see how far we can get. those wonderful kitties. Our next story comes to us from a Canadian author, Robert Munsch. And just a minute. Got to find a page with text. Ta-da! And this is The Paper Bag Princess. Elizabeth was a beautiful princess. She lived in a castle and had expensive princess clothes. She was going to marry a prince named Ronald. Unfortunately, a dragon smashed her castle, burned all her clothes with his fiery breath, and carried off Prince Ronald. Elizabeth decided to chase the dragon and get Ronald back. She looked everywhere for something to wear, but the only thing she could find that was not burnt was a paper bag. So she put on the paper bag and followed the dragon. He was easy to follow because he left a trail of burnt forests and horses' bones. Finally, Elizabeth came to a cave with a large door that had a huge knocker on it. She took hold of the knocker and banged on the door. The dragon stuck his nose out of the door and said, "Well, a princess. I love to eat princesses, but I have already eaten a whole castle today. I am a very busy dragon. Come back tomorrow." He slammed the door so fast that Elizabeth almost got her nose caught. Elizabeth grabbed the knocker and banged on the door again. The dragon stuck his nose out of the door and said, "Go away. I love to eat princesses, but I have already eaten a whole castle today. I am a very busy dragon. Come back tomorrow." "Wait!" shouted Elizabeth. "Is it true that you are the smartest and fiercest dragon in the whole world?" "Yes," said the dragon. "Is it true," said Elizabeth, "that you can burn up 10 forests with your fiery breath?" "Oh, yes," said the dragon, and he took a huge deep breath and breathed out so much fire that he burnt up 50 forests. "Fantastic," said Elizabeth, and the dragon took another huge breath and breathed out so much fire that he burnt up 100 forests. "Magnificent," said Elizabeth, and the dragon took another huge breath, but this time nothing came out. The dragon didn't even have enough fire left to cook a meatball. Elizabeth said, "Dragon, is it true that you can fly around the world in just 10 seconds?" "Why, yes," said the dragon, and jumped up and flew all way around the world in just 10 seconds. He was very tired when he got back, but Elizabeth shouted, "Fantastic! Do it again!" So the dragon jumped up and flew around the whole world in just 20 seconds. When he got back, he was too tired to talk, and he lay down and went straight to sleep. Elizabeth whispered very softly, "Hey, dragon." The dragon didn't move at all. She lifted up the dragon's ear and put her head right inside. She shouted as loud as she could, "Hey, dragon!" The dragon was so tired he didn't even move. Elizabeth walked right over to the dragon and opened the door to the cave. There was Prince Ronald. He looked at her and said, "Elizabeth, you are a mess. You smell like ashes, your hair is all tangled, and you're wearing a dirty old paper bag. Come back when you're dressed like a real princess." "Ronald," said Elizabeth, "your clothes are really pretty, and your hair is very neat. You look like a real prince, but you are a bum." They didn't get married after all. The end. And that is the Paper Bag Princess. And you shouldn't be a jerk when somebody comes to rescue you. And we're just going through a few things tonight, kind of a follow-up from last week. Pretty much. So we have our next little story from Stephen Cosgrove, and it's Leo the Lop. I think I mentioned a couple times ago, we got to meet him in Portland one time. He was signing books, and so this is a new copy for me, but I do have a signed copy of The Muffin Muncher. That's the book I read at the first show, where the dragon eats all the muffins. But my mom likes this. She likes bunnies, so that's a story for her. In a warm, gentle corner of a soft green forest, a whole bunch of bunnies were born. There were so many baby rabbits, you almost wouldn't believe it. There were white ones, brown ones, even some with spots, and every one of them had a little pink nose, fluffy white tail, and 2 pointed ears that stood straight up in the air. All of them, that is, except Leo the Lop. Now, it wasn't that Leo didn't have a little nose or a fluffy tail, for he did. What he didn't have were ears that stood up straight in the air. Instead of standing up, they hung straight down. That really didn't matter to Leo, because he thought he was just as normal as could be. Besides, he couldn't see his ears anyway. Day by day, as the rabbits got older, they began to notice that Leo was slightly different. The more they looked at him, the funnier it seemed. It got so bad that the entire burrow of bunnies would roll on the ground, holding their sides in fits of laughter every time Leo walked by. You've got to admit that a rabbit walking around with his ears dragging in the dirt is pretty funny. Now Leo was very confused. He didn't see anything so funny about the way he looked. His fur was the same. His tail was the same. As far as Leo was concerned, he was perfectly normal. Finally, out of frustration, he asked, "How come you guys are always laughing at me?" For a moment, the other rabbits tried to be serious, but they just couldn't hold back the laughter. One of the rabbits finally blurted out, "Your ears, you dope! They drag on the ground. You just aren't normal." Leo looked down, and sure enough, there were his ears dangling in the dust. I guess Leo was kind of hurt. He really didn't feel any different than the other rabbits, but because his ears hung down instead of up, he just wasn't normal. He thought. All I need is to exercise a little bit, and my ears will stand up just like all the normal rabbits. So with that in mind, he struggled and strained, trying to make them stand up. Unfortunately, the best he could do was to get them to stick straight out, and he could only do that for a minute. Then, no matter how hard he tried, they would flop back to the ground in a puff of dust. Wait, thought Leo, that didn't work. Maybe if I show my ears which way to go, they'll get the idea and get there on their own. Very carefully he climbed a tree, and after cautiously hooking his hind legs around a branch, he dangled over upside down. Sure enough, his ears hung straight down. Leo must have hung that way for nearly an hour, when a voice made him look around. "What you doing that for?" asked the voice. Leo looked around, and there, right before him, hanging from another branch, was a possum. "Well," said Leo, feeling a little foolish, "I'm hanging upside down so my ears will learn which way they're supposed to go, so I can be a normal rabbit." "What's normal?" asked the possum. "Before, when I saw you on the ground, your ears looked normal. Now they look upside down." Leo thought, and he didn't have an answer. So with a flip, he dropped to the ground. He thought, if my ears going down are normal, then the other rabbits with their ears going up aren't normal. The more he thought about the other rabbits, the funnier it became. With a laugh and a giggle, he raced off to tell them what he had discovered. In bursts of laughter, he told the other rabbits what he had found out. At first they didn't know whether to believe him, and then they started to look at one another and realized that Leo could be right. "Oh dear, what are we going to do?" they cried. "I've got an idea," said one of the rabbits. He picked up 2 big rocks, and with some twine, he tied them to the ends of his ears. Sure enough, with all that weight, his ears began to droop lower and lower until they reached the ground. Seeing his success, the other rabbits ran around, picking up rocks and tying them to their ears. Everything would have been all right, except for one small problem. The rocks and ears kept getting all tangled up in tails and feet, till all was confusion, with bunnies lying in a dusty heap. "This isn't going to work," they said. "There's got to be a better way." "Maybe," said a little furry bunny, "if we showed our ears the way they should be normally, they would go that way naturally." So they all carefully climbed a tree, and after tying their ears to a branch, they gently hooked their legs and swung over, hanging upside down. Sure enough, every one of those bunnies' ears hung up instead of down. They must have hung that way for a long time when a voice made them look around. "What you doing that for?" asked the voice. They looked, and right before them, hanging from a branch, was the very same possum. "Well," they said, feeling a little dumb, "we're hanging this way so our ears will be normal like Leo's." "What's normal?" asked the possum. "Before, when I saw you all on the ground, your ears looked normal. Now they look upside down." They all thought, and they couldn't answer the question either. Carefully, they untied their ears and flip-flopped to the ground below. The rabbits thought and thought. "If we're normal, and Leo is normal, then normal is whatever you are." With a hop and a giggle, they raced off to tell Leo what they had learned. After listening to their story, Leo had to agree that normal is whatever you are. And from that day forward, the rabbits of the burrow lived normal lives in the soft, warm forest. So if you are a rabbit and your ears go up or down, try to remember Leo and the lesson that he found. Leo did still have one small problem. His ears always drooped in his soup. The end. That's Leo the Lot by Stephen Cosgrove with illustrations by Robin James. Little bun. Alrighty. Still got a little bit of voice left. We're gonna go and get ourselves some chapters. And this is, of course, Pippi Longstocking. We read the first chapter last time. And we're picking up again with Chapter 2. Pippi is a thing finder and gets into a fight. Annika woke up early the next morning. She jumped out of bed and ran over to Tommy. "Wake up, Tommy," she cried, pulling him by the arm. "Wake up and let's go see that funny girl with the big shoes." Tommy was wide awake in an instant. "I knew, even while I was sleeping, that something exciting was going to happen today, but I didn't remember what it was," he said as he yanked off his pajama jacket. Off they went to the bathroom, washed themselves and brushed their teeth much faster than usual, had their clothes on in a twinkling, and a whole hour before their mother expected them came sliding down the banister and landed at the breakfast table. That's a good idea, Mabel. Down they sat and announced that they wanted their hot chocolate right at that very moment. "What's going to happen today that you're in such a hurry?" asked their mother. "We're going to see the new girl next door," said Tommy. "We may stay all day," said Annika. That morning, Pippi was busy making a pepperkakor, pepperkakor, I think, a kind of Swedish cookie. She had made an enormous amount of dough and rolled it out on the kitchen floor. "Because," said Pippi to her little monkey, "what earthly use is a baking board when one plans to make at least 500 cookies?" And there she lay on the floor, cutting out cookie hearts for dear life. "Stop climbing around in the dough, Mr. Nilsson," she said crossly, just as the doorbell rang. Pippi ran and opened the door. She was white as a miller from top to toe, and when she shook hands heartily with Tommy and Annika, a whole cloud of flour blew over them. "So nice," she called, she said, and shook her apron, so there's another cloud of flour. Tommy and Annika got so much in their throats that they could not help coughing. "What are you doing?" asked Tommy. "Well, if I say that I'm sweeping the chimney, you won't believe me. You're so clever," said Pippi. "Fact is, I'm baking, but I'll soon be done. You can sit on the wood box for a while." Pippi could work fast, she could. Tommy and Annika sat and watched how she went through the dough, how she threw the cookies onto the cookie pans, and swung the pans into the oven. They thought it was good as a circus. "Done," said Pippi at last, and shut the oven door on the last pans with a bang. "What are we going to do now?" asked Tommy. "I don't know what you are going to do," said Pippi, "but I know I can't lie around and be lazy. I am a thing finder, and when you're a thing finder, you don't have a moment to spare." "What did you say you are?" asked Annika. "A thing finder." "What's that?" asked Tommy. "Somebody who hunts for things, naturally. What else could it be?" said Pippi, as she swept all the flour left on the floor into a little pile. "The whole world is full of things, and somebody has to look for them. And that's just what a thing finder does," she finished. "What kind of things?" asked Annika. "Oh, all kinds," said Pippi. "Lumps of gold, ostrich feathers, dead rats, candy snap-crackers, little tiny screws, and things like that." Tommy and Annika thought it sounded as if it would be fun, and wanted very much to be a thing finders too, although Tommy did say he hoped he'd find a lump of gold and not a little tiny screw. "We shall see what we shall see," said Pippi. "One always finds something. But we've got to hurry up and get going so that other thing finders don't pick up all the lumps of gold around here before we get them." All three thing finders now set out. They decided that it would be best to begin hunting around the houses in the neighborhood, because Pippi said that although it could perfectly well happen that one might find a little screw deep in the woods, still the very best things were usually found where people were living. "Though, for that matter," she said, "I've seen it the other way, too. I remember once when I was out hunting for things in the jungles of Borneo, right in the heart of the forest, where no human being had ever set foot. What do you suppose I found? Why, a very fine wooden leg. I gave it away later to a one-legged old man, and he said that a wooden leg like that wasn't to be had for love or money." Tommy and Annika looked at Pippi to see just how a thing finder acted. Pippi ran from one side of the road to the other, shaded her eyes with her hand, and hunted and hunted. Sometimes she crawled about on her hands and knees, stuck her hands in between the pickets of a fence, and then said in a disappointed tone, "Oh dear, I was sure I saw a lump of gold." "May we really take everything we find?" asked Annika. "Yes, everything that is lying on the ground," said Pippi. Presently they came to an old man lying asleep on the lawn outside his cottage. "There," said Pippi, "that man is lying on the ground, and we have found him. We'll take him." Tommy and Annika were utterly horrified. "No, no, Pippi, we can't take an old gentleman. We couldn't possibly," said Tommy. "Anyway, whatever would we do with him?" "What would we do with him? Oh, there are plenty of things we could do with him. We could keep him in a little rabbit hutch instead of a rabbit and feed him on dandelions. But if you don't want to, I don't care, though it does bother me to think that some other thing finder may come along and grab him." They went on. Suddenly Pippi gave a terrific yell. "Well, I never saw the like," she cried, as she picked up a large, rusty old tin can from the grass. "What a find! What a find! Cans! That's something you can never have too many of." Tommy looked at the can doubtfully. "What can you use it for?" "Oh, you can use it all sorts of ways," said Pippi. "One way is to put cookies in it. Then it becomes a delightful jar with cookies. Another way is to not put cookies in it. Then it becomes a jar without cookies. That certainly isn't quite so delightful, but still, that's good too." She examined the can, which was indeed rusty, and had a hole in the bottom. "It looks almost as if this were a jar without cookies," she said thoughtfully. "But you can put it over your head and pretend that it is midnight." And that is just what she did. With the can on her head, she wandered around the block like a little metal tower, and never stopped until she stumbled over a low wire fence and fell flat on her stomach. There was a big crash when the tin can hit the ground. "Now see that?" said Pippi, and took off the can. "If I hadn't had this thing on me, I'd have fallen flat on my face and hurt myself terribly." "Yes," said Annika, "but if you hadn't had the can on your head, then you wouldn't have tripped over the wire fence in the first place." Before she finished speaking, there was another triumphant cry from Pippi, who was holding up the empty spool of thread. "It seems to be my lucky day," she said. "Such a sweet, sweet little spool to blow soap bubbles with, or to hang around my neck for a necklace. I'll go home and make one this very instant." However, just at that moment, the gate of one of the cottages nearby opened, and a boy came rushing out. He looked scared, and that was no wonder, because head over heels after him came 5 other boys. They soon caught him and pushed him against the fence, and all 5 began to punch and hit him. He cried and held his arms in front of his face to protect himself. "Give it to him! Give it to him!" cried the oldest and strongest of the boys, "so that he'll never dare to show himself on this street again." "Oh," said Annika, "it's Willie they're hurting. Oh, how can they be so mean?" "It's that awful Bengt. He's always in a fight," said Tommy. "And 5 against 1. What cowards!" Pippi went up to the boys and tapped Bengt on the back with her forefinger. "Hello there," she said. "What's the idea? Are you trying to make hash out of little Willie with all 5 of you jumping on him at once?" Bengt turned around and saw a little girl he had never seen before, a wild-looking little stranger who dared to touch him. For a while he stood and gaped at her in astonishment. Then a broad grin spread over his face. "Boys," he said, "boys, let Willie alone and take a look at this girl. What a babe!" He slapped his knees and laughed, and in an instant they had all flocked around Pippi, all except Willie, who wiped away his tears and walked cautiously over to stand beside Tommy. "Have you ever seen hair like hers? Red as fire, and such shoes," Bengt continued. "Can't I borrow one? I'd like to go out rowing, and I haven't any boat." He took hold of one of Pippi's braids, but dropped it instantly and cried, "Ouch! I burn myself!" Then all 5 boys joined hands around Pippi, jumping up and down and screaming, "Redhead! Redhead!" Pippi stood in the middle of the ring and smiled in the friendliest way. Bengt had hoped she would get mad and cry. At least, she ought to have looked scared. When nothing happened, he gave her a push. "I don't think you have a very nice way with ladies," said Pippi. And she lifted him up in her strong arms high in the air and carried him to a birch tree and hung him over a branch. Then she took the next boy and hung him over another branch. The next one she sat on a gate-post outside a cottage, and the next she threw right over a fence, so that he landed in a flower bed. The last of the fighters she put in a tiny toy cart that stood by the road. Then Pippi, Tommy, Annika, and Willie stood and looked at the boys for a while. The boys were absolutely speechless with fright. And Pippi said, "You are cowards. 5 of you attacking one boy. That's cowardly. Then you begin to push a helpless little girl around. Oh, how mean! Come now, we'll go home, she said to Tommy and Annika. And to Willie, if they try to hurt you again, you come and tell me. And to Bengt, who sat up in the tree and didn't dare to stir, she said, Is there anything else you have to say about my hair or my shoes? If so, you'd better say it now before I go home. But Bengt had nothing more to say about Pippi's shoes or about her hair either. So Pippi took her can in one hand and her spool in the other and went away, followed by Tommy and Annika. When they were back home in Pippi's garden, Pippi said, Dear me, how awful! Here I found 2 beautiful things, and you didn't get anything. You must hunt a little more. Tommy, why don't you look in that old hollow tree? Old trees are usually about the best places for all thing-finders. Tommy said that he didn't believe he and Annika would ever find anything, but to please Pippi, he put his hand slowly down into the hollow tree trunk. Goodness! He cried, utterly amazed, and pulled out his hand. In it he held a little notebook with a leather cover. In a special loop there was a little silver pencil. Well, that's odd, said Timmy. Now see that? Said Pippi. There's nothing so nice as being a thing-finder. It's a wonder there aren't more people that take it up. There'll be tailors and shoemakers and chimney sweeps and such like. But thing-finders, no indeed. That isn't good enough for them. And then she said to Annika, Why don't you feel in that old tree stump? One practically always finds things in old tree stumps. Annika stuck her hand down in the stump, and almost immediately got hold of a red coral necklace. She and Tommy stood open-mouthed for a long time. They were so astonished. They thought that hereafter they would be thing-finders every single day. Pippi had been up half the night before, playing ball, and now she suddenly felt sleepy. I think I'll go and take a nap, she said. Can't you come with me and tuck me in? When Pippi was sitting on the edge of the bed, taking off her shoes, she looked at them thoughtfully and said, He was going out rowing, he said, that old Bengt. She snorted disdainfully. I'll teach him to row, indeed I will, another time. Say, Pippi, said Tommy respectfully, why do you wear such big shoes? So I can wiggle my toes, of course, she answered. Then she crept into bed. She always slept with her feet on the pillow and her head way down under the quilt. That's the way they sleep in Guatemala, she announced. And that's the only real way to sleep. See, like this, I can wiggle my toes when I'm sleeping, too. Can you go to sleep without a lullaby? She went on. I always have to sing to myself for a while, otherwise I can't sleep a wink. Tommy and Annika heard a humming sound under the quilt. It was Pippi singing herself to sleep. Quietly and cautiously, they tiptoed out so that they would not disturb her. In the doorway, they turned to take a last look toward the bed. They could see nothing of Pippi except her feet resting on the pillow. There she lay, wiggling her toes emphatically. Tommy and Annika ran home. Annika held her coral necklace tightly in her hand. That certainly was strange, she said. Tommy, you don't suppose, do you suppose, that Pippi had put these things in place beforehand? You never can tell, said Tommy. You just never can tell about anything when it comes to Pippi. That's the end of Chapter 2. Well, thank you, all of you, for coming and listening to some stories. I'm sorry the voice isn't where it usually is. Exactly, Mabel. Pippi's a force of nature, and the stories get her stories get a little far-fetched, but that's okay. she can lift a horse in her hand. So what the heck? She's having a good time. But yeah, I just appreciate you all being here, and I'm gonna wrap it up for tonight. And I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful Sunday, and hope to see you again next weekend. We could try a raid. I haven't done that before. Let's see. There's a music streamer. Yeah, let's go there. We're gonna it's gonna change a little bit. We're gonna switch to some music. We're gonna raid Thug Shells. She's a hip hop artist, rapper, and DJ up in Canada, and is a sweet person. And let's see. This is my first raid. We'll see how this works. Thank you all for coming along, and there we go. Oh boy, it's counting down. Take care, everybody. Have a wonderful, wonderful evening.